In 1863, the Rothschild banking family published an internal memo. It wasn't meant for public distribution. The document surfaced in a private archive sale in 2011, part of an estate collection that had been sealed for over a century. The memo was addressed to branch managers across their European banking network, and when I first read what it said, I understood why it had been kept hidden for so long. Because powerful people, the people who control money and markets and governments, they work very hard to make sure certain ideas never reach you. Ideas about how society used to function. Ideas about alternatives to the system we live under now. Ideas that would make you question whether the way things are is the way things have to be. This memo was one of those ideas, and what it revealed wasn't just about banking strategy. It was about the deliberate destruction of an entire economic system, a system that had worked for centuries, a system that built the greatest architectural achievements in human history, a system that kept people housed and fed and purposeful without creating the poverty and debt we accept as normal today. The memo was short, direct, clinical in its assessment of what the Rothschilds saw as a threat to their entire business model. The guild system represents an existential threat to fractional reserve banking. That's how it started. Communities operating under guild provision demonstrate immunity to debt-based capital control. Traditional banking mechanisms fail to penetrate guild-organized economies. Then came the directive. Recommend aggressive displacement through industrialization mandates and monetary requirement legislation. Priority highest. Timeline immediate implementation across all operational territories. Read that again slowly. They weren't describing a competitor bank. They weren't talking about a rival financial system. They were identifying entire communities that didn't need banks at all. Communities that functioned perfectly well without debt, without interest payments, without the financial mechanisms that made the Rothschild family the most powerful banking dynasty in the world. And their solution wasn't to offer better services. It was to destroy those communities, aggressively, immediately, everywhere they had influence. I started tracing what happened next. The period between 1865 and 1900, just 35 years. And what I found was systematic, coordinated, continent-wide dismantling of every economic structure that didn't require banking. Laws were passed across Europe requiring all wages to be paid in national currency. No exceptions allowed. Barter became criminalized in major cities. Alternative exchange systems were reclassified as tax evasion. Guilds were dissolved by government mandate. Their properties were seized. Their records were burned. Their members were forced into factory work where they would receive monetary wages that could be taxed, controlled, and most importantly, deposited in banks. And as the guilds disappeared, something else happened. Something no economic historian wants to discuss openly. Productivity dropped. Building quality declined catastrophically. The incredible craftsmanship that defined the 1700s and 1800s became impossible to replicate. As if the banking system that replaced the guilds couldn't produce what guilds had created without using money at all. This isn't just about Tartaria, though Tartaria perfected this system on a scale we can barely comprehend today. This is about what humanity lost when we replaced an economy based on contribution with an economy based on debt. And it's about why the people who control money never ever want you to remember that alternatives existed. Alternatives that worked. Alternatives that built cathedrals and palaces and infrastructure that's still standing centuries later. Alternatives that didn't make anyone rich, but kept everyone secure. Let me show you how it actually worked. Because once you see it, once you understand what was taken from us you can never look at money the same way again. There's a building in Prague that shouldn't exist, according to everything modern economics teaches us. The Church of St. Nicholas. Construction began in 1704 and was completed in 1735. 31 continuous years of work involving thousands of skilled craftsmen. The building is massive. The dome alone required 200,000 individually carved stones, each one precisely shaped to fit into the curved structure. The interior frescoes cover over 16,000 square feet of ceiling and were painted by a single artist who spent 18 years lying on scaffolding above the floor. There are intricate sculptures, extensive gilding, marble columns that were shipped all the way from Italy, copper roof work that required master metal workers with decades of experience. When I visited Prague, I spent 3 days sitting in the city archives with one specific goal. I wanted to find the payment records. How did they pay for this enormous project? Who financed it? Where are the wage ledgers showing what workers were paid? I found construction documentation, hundreds and hundreds of pages. Materials list documenting every piece of stone, every ounce of copper, every timber beam. Schedules showing the timeline of work. Worker assignments listing which craftsmen were on site on which days. Daily logs noting progress on different parts of the building. Detailed accounts describing where stone was quarried, how copper was sourced, which forest provided the timber. But when I got to the financial records, to the sections that should document wages and costs and budgets, there was almost nothing there. Just blank pages with occasional notes written in the margins. One note stopped me completely. It was written in faded ink in what looked like the project manager's handwriting from almost 300 years ago. Provision made through guild system. No monetary exchange recorded. No monetary exchange for a project that employed thousands of people for 31 years. I showed this documentation to a friend of mine, an economist with a doctorate from Oxford, who specializes in early modern European economic history. I asked him to explain to me how this was possible. How do you mobilize thousands of skilled workers for 3 decades without paying them? He couldn't explain it. He said the documentation must be incomplete, that payment records were probably kept somewhere else and were subsequently lost over the centuries, that there's simply no way to organize that much skilled labor without monetary payment. But I kept finding the same pattern. Cathedral after cathedral, palace after palace, massive infrastructure projects including bridges, aqueducts, city halls, all of them with meticulous records documenting materials and labor, but virtually no records of monetary payment to workers. The standard explanation is that records were lost, that we're missing crucial documentation, that surely they must have paid people somehow, and we just don't have proof anymore. But what if that's the wrong way to think about it entirely? What if these buildings weren't paid for in the way we understand payment? What if the economy they were built in didn't work that way at all? What if the Tartarian economy, the guild economy that built these structures, wasn't based on monetary payment in the first place? I found a document in Vienna that completely changed how I understood everything I'd been researching. A guild charter from 1722. The Stonemasons Guild of Vienna. It's not a business contract. It's not an employment agreement. It's a detailed system of mutual obligation written out in formal legal language. The charter describes exactly how the guild functions. If you want to become a stonemason, you begin as an apprentice with an established master. The master doesn't pay you wages. You don't pay the master for training. Instead, the guild itself provides your housing, your food, your tools, your clothing, everything you need to survive and learn while you're developing your skills. You work during this time, not for money, but to learn the craft. And in exchange for teaching you, for passing on knowledge that took him decades to acquire, the master receives something different. He receives recognition, status within the guild structure, increased standing in the community. The more skilled apprentices he successfully trains, the more respected he becomes. When you complete your apprenticeship and become what they called a journeyman, the arrangement evolves. You're now skilled enough to contribute meaningfully to actual projects. So you work on guild commissions, churches, public buildings, projects for wealthy patrons, but you still don't receive monetary wages. Instead, the guild continues to provide everything you need, but now you have access to better housing than apprentices receive, better quality food, better tools. You're contributing more value to the system, so you receive more from the system. Not through payment, but through provision. If you eventually demonstrate enough mastery to become a full master yourself, the provisions increase again. You can take on your own apprentices. You can propose projects to the guild council. You can live in one of the master houses that the guild maintains specifically for senior craftsmen. Your family is completely provided for. Your children receive education. Your old age is secured regardless of whether you can still work. All of this happens without a single coin changing hands. The charter is completely explicit about this arrangement. It states directly that no member shall require monetary payment for work performed in service of guild projects. All provision shall be made through collective resources administered by guild masters according to contribution and need. I sat in that Vienna archive for hours just staring at this 300-year-old document, because it wasn't describing poverty. It wasn't describing charity or welfare. It was describing a sophisticated economic system that distributed resources based on what you could contribute and ensured that everyone's needs were met regardless of their current productivity level. And this system worked for centuries, producing the greatest architecture, the finest craftsmanship, the most skilled artisans in human history, without using money at all. But then I started finding these objects in museums all across Europe that everyone labels as coins. Except when you actually examine them closely, they don't function like coins at all. The British Museum has 47 of them in their collection, all dated before 1850, all catalogued as currency from various European regions. But when you look at them carefully, nothing about them makes sense as money. First of all, they're far too perfect. These are supposedly hand-struck coins from the 17 and 1800s, created with manual tools and techniques. But there's absolutely no variation in weight between different examples. No variation in dimensions. They're identical to within a tiny fraction of a millimeter. That kind of precision wasn't possible with hand-striking technology. It's barely possible with modern automated minting. Second, they show no wear at all. Real coins that circulate through an economy get scratched. They get worn down. The edges become rough. Details become less sharp over time. But these objects look like they were manufactured yesterday, as if they were never actually used for buying and selling things. Third, and most strangely, the symbols stamped on them aren't denominations. They're not marked with values the way normal money is. Instead, they have geometric patterns, compasses and squares and levels, the specific tools associated with particular guilds. And on the reverse side, what look like coordinates, angular measurements, geometric ratios. I asked a museum curator in London about these objects. She was refreshingly honest with me. We call them coins because we don't have a better term for them, she told me. But functionally, they don't behave like currency. They're too valuable as physical objects to spend on ordinary purchases, too standardized to be merely decorative, too widespread across different regions to be rare collector's items. We believe they might have been something else entirely, some kind of credential system or access tokens, but we genuinely don't understand the system they were part of. That admission sent me down another research path. I started looking for every reference to these objects I could find in historical documents, and gradually, a pattern started emerging. They weren't currency at all. They were proof of mastery within the guild system, proof of contribution, proof that you had achieved a certain level of skill and were entitled to certain provisions from the collective resources. A master stonemason would carry a token showing the compass and square. That token gave him access to guild houses across Europe wherever he traveled. It guaranteed provision in any city with an active guild. It identified him as someone who contributed to the system and was therefore entitled to receive from the system. But here's the crucial part that makes them completely different from money. You couldn't buy these tokens. You couldn't trade for them. You couldn't accumulate them the way you accumulate wealth. You earned them through demonstrated mastery, through years of contribution, through creating work that the Guild Council examined and certified as meeting their standards. And they were non-transferable. Each token was marked with symbols specific to the individual bearer. If you died, your token went back to the guild. It couldn't be inherited by your children, couldn't be sold to someone else, couldn't become capital that generated more wealth. This is the exact opposite of how money functions. Money is designed to be transferred, accumulated, inherited, turned into more money through investment and interest. These tokens couldn't do any of that. They were proof of what you could contribute to the community, not proof of what you could extract from it. And the entire Tartarian economy ran on contribution rather than extraction. I found actual guild ledgers from 1840 in the archives of the Worshipful Company of Carpenters in London. These ledgers document something absolutely fascinating. They list every member of the guild, and next to each name, instead of documenting wealth or property or monetary assets, they list contributions. One entry reads, Master Thomas Whitfield trained 7 apprentices to journeyman status, completed altar work at St. Martin's Church, designed joint system for Westminster Hall repairs, contribution assessed as exemplary. Below his name, the ledger lists his provisions: housing provided in master quarters, 4th District. Food allocation includes full provision for family of 6. Tool access to all workshop facilities. Education for 3 children enrolled in guild school. There's no money anywhere in this documentation. No wages listed. No prices. No costs. Just contribution and provision. You give according to your ability and skill level. You receive according to your needs and your demonstrated mastery. Another entry caught my attention. Journeyman Robert Clark. Contribution assessed as adequate. 3 projects completed to standard. No apprentices yet trained. His provisions were more modest than Master Whitfield's. Housing in journeyman quarters, shared with other journeymen. Food allocation for individual only. Tool access limited to standard equipment. The system was sophisticated. It tracked contribution carefully. It rewarded mastery in teaching. It ensured that basic needs were met for everyone while incentivizing excellence and skill development. But it never converted any of this into monetary values or prices. And here's what made the whole system sustainable. The guild owned property, substantial amounts of property. They owned workshops and forests and stone quarries and farmland and entire blocks of housing. These were guild commons, resources held collectively and managed for the benefit of all contributing members. You didn't buy your way into this system. You couldn't. There was nothing to purchase. You contributed your way into it through demonstrated skill and commitment, and the more skilled your contribution became, the more access you had to the collective resources the guild controlled. I started imagining what this meant in practical terms for someone's actual life. A master stonemason didn't need to worry about retirement savings. The guild maintained houses specifically for elderly craftsmen who could no longer work actively. He didn't worry about his children's education. Guild schools taught the next generation of craftsmen. He didn't worry about medical care when he got sick. Guild physicians treated members as part of the provision system. None of this required money because all of it was organized around the principle of contribution and provision, rather than transaction and payment. And the buildings they created, the cathedrals and palaces, those weren't products being made for sale. Those were permanent contributions to the community. Your work outlived you. Your name was carved into the stone of what you built. The building itself was your payment, in a sense, your legacy, your immortality. So here's the question I kept asking myself. Why did this system disappear? Why did something that worked successfully for centuries, that produced unprecedented quality, that kept people housed and fed and purposeful without creating the poverty and desperation we see as normal today, why did it vanish almost completely in just 35 years? Because it was destroyed, deliberately and systematically, by banking interests that correctly identified it as a threat to their entire business model. That 1863 Rothschild memo wasn't just analysis, it was a declaration of economic war, and I found the specific weapons they used to fight that war. In 1865, Britain passed something called the Master and Servant Act. The law required that all labour contracts specify monetary wages. You could no longer legally work in exchange for provision, for training, for access to collective resources. Every work arrangement had to involve payment in official currency, and that currency had to flow through the banking system where it could be tracked and taxed. France passed similar legislation in 1867. Germany followed in 1871. Italy in 1876. Country after country, year after year, laws that forced the monetization of all labor relationships. But the laws went much further than just requiring wages. They actively criminalized the alternatives. Barter between individuals was classified as tax evasion. Guild provision systems were declared illegal monopolistic trusts. Collective ownership of property was broken up and forcibly privatized. I found a court case from 1873 that shows exactly how this worked in practice. The Crown versus the Worshipful Company of Carpenters. The Guild was formally charged with operating an illegal economic system. Their defense was straightforward. They argued they'd been operating the exact same way for over 400 years, that they weren't evading taxes because they weren't conducting taxable monetary transactions. That provision of needs wasn't the same thing as income that could be taxed. The court ruled against them. The judge stated that labor has monetary value, whether it's paid in coin or in provision. That value must be assessed in currency terms, must be taxed, and must be documented through the banking system. The Guild was given a choice: either monetize their entire operation or dissolve completely. They dissolved. Between 1865 and 1900, more than 3,000 guilds across Europe were forcibly disbanded through similar legal actions. Their properties were seized by governments and then sold to private interests. Their members were scattered into factory wage work. Their historical records were systematically destroyed. Official histories describe this period as progress. They tell us that industrialization required wage labor, that guilds were outdated medieval institutions, That monetization was an inevitable step forward in economic development. But I found data that tells a completely different story. Production records from before and after the Guild dissolution. In 1860, the city of Vienna had 47 master stonemasons operating through the traditional Guild system. They completed an average of 12 major building projects per year: churches, public buildings, monuments, all of exceptional quality that's still admired today. By 1900, Vienna had over 300 stonemasons working for monetary wages in private construction firms. They completed an average of 8 major projects per year, and architectural historians consistently note the dramatic, undeniable decline in craftsmanship quality after 1880. More workers employed, fewer projects completed, significantly lower quality in what was built. The Guild system was more productive. It produced better results, and it accomplished all of this without requiring anyone to profit from extracting value from someone else's labor. That's exactly why it had to be destroyed. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well without making bankers wealthy and necessary. Let me show you the mechanism of how banking destroyed what guilds had created, because understanding this is crucial. Under the Guild system, a stonemason's basic needs were provided by the collective. He didn't need money to survive, which meant he didn't need to borrow money, which meant he couldn't go into debt, which meant he couldn't be charged interest, which meant banks couldn't profit from his labor at all. When guilds were forcibly dissolved and workers were pushed into wage labor, everything changed fundamentally. Now the stonemason needed money for everything. Money to pay rent because guild housing was gone. Money to buy food because guild provision ended. Money to purchase tools because guild workshops were closed. He had to buy everything that the guild system used to provide collectively. But the wages offered were deliberately kept low. This wasn't an accident. Employers paid the absolute minimum necessary to keep workers alive and able to work, which meant workers couldn't accumulate any savings. So when emergencies happened, when tools broke or illness struck or seasonal work slowed down, workers had no choice but to borrow. That's precisely when banks became essential rather than optional. Workers borrowed money at interest, fell into debt, then spent their entire lives working just to pay off loans with interest rates carefully calculated to ensure they could never fully escape. The stonemason went from being a respected master craftsman, contributing to collective resources and receiving lifetime provision, and building monuments that carried his name forever, to being a replaceable wage laborer renting a room, buying food day by day, working on projects owned by distant employers, forever trapped in debt to banking institutions. This wasn't progress towards something better. This was capture, the deliberate, systematic transformation of free, skilled craftsmen into perpetual debt servants. And the quality of work collapsed because workers no longer had any incentive to excel at their craft. Under the guild system, better work meant higher status in the community, better provision for your family, and your name permanently inscribed on lasting monuments. Under the wage labor system, better work just meant more profit for your employer, while your wages stayed exactly the same. I found a quote from a master carpenter in London written in 1892 that captures this transformation perfectly. He wrote, "I was trained in the old system. I became a master at age 30. I taught 11 apprentices who became masters themselves. I built work I was deeply proud of. Now I work in a furniture factory. I'm paid 4 shillings a day. I make the same table over and over, hundreds of times. My children will never know my name. I owe the bank more money than I'll earn in 5 years of constant work. They called this progress. That's the real story of what happened to the guilds. They weren't replaced by something more advanced or efficient. They were destroyed by something more profitable. Profitable for banks. Profitable for factory owners who could now extract value from workers. But absolutely devastating for the workers themselves and for the quality of everything human beings created. But here's what keeps me awake thinking about this. The guild system, the Tartarian economy. It wasn't unique to Europe. It wasn't even unique to builders and craftsmen. I found evidence of similar systems everywhere human beings organized themselves before banking systems took control. Indigenous communities worldwide operated gift economies, potlatch systems, elaborate networks of reciprocal obligation, all of them functioning without money, without debt, with sophisticated and effective mechanisms for distributing resources based on contribution and need. In the Pacific Northwest, coastal tribes held potlatch ceremonies where leaders would give away enormous amounts of resources. Food, tools, ceremonial objects, blankets, sometimes everything they owned. This wasn't charity. It wasn't even generosity in the way we understand it. It was a demonstration of the community's abundance and the leader's connection to that abundance. The more you could give away, the higher your status rose. Your wealth was measured by how much you could provide to others, not by how much you could accumulate and keep. Anthropologists used to describe these as primitive economies, as if people who didn't use money were somehow intellectually unsophisticated. But when you actually study how these systems functioned in practice, they were incredibly complex. They distributed resources efficiently across entire regions. They created strong incentives for contribution. They prevented the kind of accumulation that inevitably creates massive inequality. And they were all destroyed. Every single one. Not because better systems replaced them, but because colonial powers needed populations to use official currency so they could be taxed, controlled, and fully integrated into banking systems. The British government banned potlatch ceremonies in 1884, made it literally illegal to give away your own resources. You had to sell them instead, for money. That could be taxed and tracked. The pattern is global and consistent. Every alternative to money-based economy was systematically criminalized, actively suppressed, or violently destroyed. And we're taught in schools that this was inevitable, that money is natural, that there's simply no other way to organize complex societies. But that's a deliberate lie. And the evidence proving it's a lie is all around us if we look. The cathedrals that were built without any money. The guild ledgers documenting provision without payment. The indigenous systems that sustained communities successfully for thousands of years without currency. The truth is that money isn't necessary for civilization to function, but it is absolutely necessary for control. And banking interests will do anything at all, to maintain the illusion that there's no alternative to their system. I started wondering whether these contribution-based systems could possibly work in the modern world, whether we could organize economy around contribution instead of monetary transaction. And I found something genuinely surprising. They already do work, right now, in spaces the banking system hasn't fully captured yet. Open source software, millions of programmers around the world contributing code without receiving payment, creating operating systems, web browsers, development tools that literally run the entire internet. Not for wages, not for profit, but for reputation within the community, for mastery of their craft, for the deep satisfaction of meaningful contribution. Most of these contributors don't starve. Many have regular day jobs. Some receive voluntary donations. Some are supported by companies that benefit from their work. But the code itself, the actual creative work, is produced through contribution rather than transaction. And it works. It's often more reliable and secure than expensive corporate software. Wikipedia. Millions of articles written by completely unpaid contributors. The most comprehensive knowledge repository in human history, created without a single monetary transaction. People contribute simply because they want to, because they know things, because they want to share knowledge freely. Creative Commons. Thousands of artists releasing work without copyright restrictions. Musicians sharing compositions. Writers publishing openly. All of them contributing to collective cultural resources without demanding payment. These are guild systems. Digital guilds operating in the modern world. Contribution-based economies existing inside the larger monetary system. And they're systematically marginalized, chronically underfunded, constantly threatened by corporations trying to privatize and monetize what contributors created freely. I even found modern attempts to recreate physical guild-like systems, intentional communities, cooperative housing projects, tool libraries where you borrow equipment instead of buying it, time banking networks where people exchange skills and labor without using money. And almost all of them face serious legal challenges. Zoning laws prohibit certain collective living arrangements. Tax codes penalize non-monetary exchange. Banking regulations require everything to be documented and valued in currency terms, even when no currency is involved. It's not that these systems don't work. They work extremely well where they're allowed to exist. The problem is that they're not allowed to spread and succeed, because if they did, if they became widespread and normal, people would start realizing that money is actually optional, that banks are unnecessary, that we could organize society around contribution and provision instead of debt and control. And that realization would completely end the power of everyone who currently profits from our dependency on money. Let me show you what we lost in the clearest possible terms. Under the Tartarian guild economy, you worked to master a craft through years of dedicated apprenticeship. You contributed that craft to collective projects that benefited the entire community. Your needs were provided by the guild regardless of your current productivity. Your status rose with your skill and your teaching, rather than with accumulated wealth. Your work carried your name forever carved into lasting monuments. You never went into debt because you never needed to borrow money. You never paid interest to banks. You never feared unemployment, poverty, or homelessness because provision was guaranteed. Your children were educated through the guild system. Your old age was completely secure whether you could work or not. And the buildings you created lasted for centuries and still inspire awe today. Under the banking economy that violently replaced it, you work for wages that are never quite enough. You contribute to projects owned by distant others who profit from your labor. You buy your basic needs with money that somehow never stretches far enough. Your status is determined by how much wealth you can accumulate and display. Your work is completely anonymous. You live in constant debt from the moment you're born. You pay interest on absolutely everything. You fear job loss constantly because it means immediate catastrophe. Your children inherit your debt along with whatever assets you manage to accumulate. Your old age depends entirely on savings you could never quite build up. And the buildings we create today fall apart within decades and require constant, expensive maintenance. Which system actually sounds more advanced when you lay it out honestly? The guild economy produced the Sistine Chapel, Chartres Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica, the Alhambra, Notre Dame, structures that have lasted 500 years and still inspire profound awe in everyone who sees them. The banking economy produces strip malls that need complete renovation every 20 years and office buildings that become obsolete before they're even paid off. The guild economy trained masters through decades of careful apprenticeship, creating craftsmen whose skills became legendary and whose techniques we still can't fully replicate today. The banking economy trains workers through a few weeks of basic orientation, creating employees who are deliberately kept replaceable and interchangeable. The guild economy built actual communities where contribution was genuinely valued and basic needs were reliably met. The banking economy builds isolation where accumulation is valued and scarcity is deliberately manufactured to maintain control. We didn't progress forward. We were systematically downgraded, and they convinced us to call it advancement. That 1863 Rothschild memo understood something absolutely crucial. Guild economies demonstrate immunity to debt-based capital control. That's a direct quote. You cannot control people who don't need to borrow money to survive. You cannot extract wealth from communities that share resources collectively. You cannot charge interest to craftsmen whose needs are provided by the system they contribute to. So the banking system didn't try to compete with guilds. It destroyed them through legislation, through criminalization, through the systematic use of government force. And then it rewrote history completely, taught us in schools that guilds were primitive and backward, that money is natural and inevitable, that there's no realistic alternative to debt-based economy. But the buildings remain standing. The cathedrals that were built without bank loans, the palaces that were constructed without financial capital, the infrastructure that was created through contribution rather than transaction. They stand today as physical evidence, undeniable proof that civilization functioned successfully, that it thrived, that it created transcendent beauty and lasting permanence, all without money. The Tartarian economy worked, not in theory or imagination, in actual practice for centuries, producing the greatest achievements of human culture. And it was destroyed not because it failed at anything, but because it succeeded too well without making bankers rich and necessary. Every time you walk past an old cathedral, you're looking at proof, physical proof that we don't need them. Proof that another way of organizing society is genuinely possible. Proof that the system we live under now isn't inevitable or natural or the only option. It's just profitable. For banks. For the people who control money and use that control to extract wealth from everyone else. And they will do absolutely anything to make sure you never remember that alternatives exist. But I remember now. And if you've stayed with me this far, you remember too. The question is, what we do